Buenos Aires, March 1960. A man boards a city bus. He is in his early 50s. Thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses. He carries a newspaper folded under one arm and a small paper bag from the market. He finds a window seat. He does not look at the other passengers. He never looks at the other passengers. His name, according to his identity documents, is Ricardo Clement. He works the line at a Mercedes-Benz factory in the suburb of San Fernando. He pays his bills. He minds his business. He is, by every visible measure, nobody in a car parked 2 blocks from the bus stop. A man named Zvi Aharoni watches through the windshield and says nothing. Aharoni is one of the finest intelligence interrogators in Israel. He has a folder on the seat beside him. Photographs, physical measurements, eyewitness descriptions. He knows the shape of this man's ears, the specific way he tilts his head when he is being careful. As Ricardo Clement steps off the bus and turns toward Garibaldi Street, Aharoni makes a single notation in his field log. Not Eichmann. He drives away. He is wrong. And because he is wrong, Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the deportation and murder of 6 million Jews, will remain free for another 2 months, walking that same street, riding that same bus, while one of the most capable intelligence services in the world scrambles to understand how it just looked directly at him and saw someone else. But that failure is not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what Mossad decided to do next. They sent in a priest. Before we go further, here is something for you, because you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. We put together a limited edition ebook, a collection of real operations where identity itself was the weapon. Men who wore a collar, a name, a whole invented life, and walked into rooms that would have killed them on the spot if the performance had cracked for even a second. The covers that worked, and the ones that consumed the person wearing them long after the mission ended. These are the cases that never made it into any public record. If this is the world you cannot look away from, this book is where it lives. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us, because this story is just getting started. There is a version of this story that begins in 1945 in a detention camp in southern Germany, where American soldiers are processing thousands of prisoners of war. One of them gives a false name. He is processed as a low-level nobody. He is assigned a bunk, a number, a ration card. Nobody looks twice at him. In January 1946, he walks away. That man is Adolf Eichmann. He will not be found for 14 years. Before we talk about the priest, you need to understand who Eichmann actually was, because the official image of him, the one he carefully constructed and maintained, was one of the greatest personal deceptions of the 20th century. Eichmann was not a soldier. He was not a battlefield commander. He attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the meeting where the Third Reich finalized the logistics of the final solution, and he sat at the back of the room, taking minutes. He was the secretary, the note-taker, the man who made sure the paperwork moved correctly. What the paperwork concerned was the organized murder of an entire people. Eichmann ran the trains. He allocated rolling stock. He negotiated deportation schedules with the German railway system. When Hungarian officials hesitated over deportation timelines in 1944, citing resource constraints and international attention, Eichmann did not hesitate. He pushed harder. He argued for tighter schedules. He got them. In a recorded interview conducted in Buenos Aires, years after the war, an interview he gave believing it would one day vindicate him, Eichmann said he would go to his grave laughing. That the feeling of 5 million deaths on his conscience was, for him, a source of extraordinary satisfaction. He said this on tape, in a living room, in Argentina, while his neighbors thought he was a factory worker named Ricardo. That interview will matter. We will return to it. After walking out of American custody in 1946, Eichmann spent 4 years moving through post-war Germany and Austria under borrowed identities. He worked on farms. He moved when attention got close. He had a network, former SS colleagues, sympathizers, men who believed the Nuremberg trials were persecution and the perpetrators were victims. In 1950, the network delivered him to Italy. What happened in Italy is not a conspiracy theory. It is confirmed by declassified intelligence files, Vatican archive research, and the testimony of the men who ran it. There was a bishop in Rome named Alois Hudal. He was Austrian by birth, based at a German-Austrian seminary called Santa Maria dell'Anima. He had praised Adolf Hitler in print in 1937. After the war, through his role ministering to German-speaking prisoners across Italy, he had obtained something extraordinarily useful: access to internment camps, relationships with Red Cross officials, and the moral authority of the Catholic Church. He used all of it to move Nazis out of Europe. Hudal forged international Red Cross travel documents. He obtained Argentine immigration visas through contacts in the Pern government. He requested, in a 1948 letter written directly to Juan Pern, 5,000 immigration slots, 3,000 for Germans, 2,000 for Austrians, describing the applicants as anti-communist fighters whose wartime sacrifice had saved Europe from Soviet domination. He meant SS officers, death camp administrators, men whose names appeared in Allied war crimes files. Pern agreed. The rat line, as these escape routes came to be called, worked because of the image the church projected. A man crossing a checkpoint with documents signed by a Catholic bishop was not questioned the same way a man with government forgeries was. The cloth created legitimacy. In post-war Catholic Italy, that legitimacy was nearly impenetrable. Eichmann crossed through Italy in the summer of 1950. He boarded a ship at the port of Genoa. His papers, obtained through the network connected to Hudal's operation, described him as a Tyrolean laborer seeking agricultural work in Argentina. His Red Cross travel document was almost certainly forged. His Argentine entry visa was genuine. He disembarked in Buenos Aires as Ricardo Clement. 10 years later, a Mossad operative would use the same disguise, the same cloth, the same collar, the same image of Catholic priesthood, to find him. The symmetry is not coincidental. It is the only tool that could have worked. Zvi Aharoni's negative report had created a crisis inside Israeli intelligence. The surveillance had been ongoing for weeks. The address provided by Fritz Bauer, the Jewish Attorney General of the German state of Hesse, who had been quietly building a case while his own government looked the other way, had been correct. The physical description matched. The timeline matched. And yet, Aharoni, one of the most reliable identifiers in the service, had watched the man walk home and written, not Eichmann. Harel did not pull the team. He added to it. What was needed was not more surveillance from parked cars. What was needed was someone who could enter the community itself, the tight insular network of German immigrants in Buenos Aires, many of whom had arrived in the early 1950s without quite explaining where they had been during the war. People who socialized together, worshipped together, and did not welcome strangers. There was one kind of stranger who moved through closed communities without raising suspicion. A Mossad operative arrived in Buenos Aires in late March 1960. His papers identified him as a visiting priest from a German-speaking parish in southern Europe, traveling on a diocesan exchange program. He carried letters of introduction signed, in forgeries so precise they were never questioned, by officials of a legitimate Catholic institution. He wore a cassock. He spoke German with a Bavarian accent. He had been prepared exhaustively on Catholic liturgy, on the specific vocabulary used in Argentine German parishes, on the exact texture of clerical small talk. He had also been told something that no amount of preparation could fully address. The German community in Buenos Aires was not politically neutral. Some of the men he would drink wine with had blood on their hands. Some of them knew who Ricardo Clement actually was. Some of them were protecting him, not out of sentiment, but out of shared exposure. If Eichmann was found, the questions would not stop with him. If the operative asked one wrong question, if he showed one flicker of interest in the wrong name, he would not be asked to leave. He would simply stop being heard from. He arrived at his first German language mass in the Palermo district on a Sunday morning. He took a seat near the front. He bowed his head at the appropriate moments. He received communion with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. After the service, the parish priest introduced him to the congregation. "A visiting brother," he said, "from Germany." Passing through. Several of the older men in the congregation shook his hand. One of them, a man in his late 60s, thick through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to react to things, held his hand a moment longer than necessary. He looked at the operative's face. He said nothing. He let go and turned away. The operative did not know who that man was. He was not in any file he had been given. And there was no way, in that moment, to ask. He had been in Buenos Aires for 4 hours. He had already encountered something his briefing had not prepared him for. And somewhere, a few kilometers north, Ricardo Clement was having dinner with his family. The operative's name, in the file that Mossad would never fully declassify, appears only as a set of initials. In the community he had entered, he was Father Stefan. He had been in Buenos Aires for 11 days when he attended his first community dinner, a birthday celebration for an elderly German woman who had arrived in Argentina in 1952 and who hosted, every few months, a gathering of the neighborhood's German families in her front sitting room. The operative had been invited by the parish priest, who meant it kindly. A young visiting brother, far from home. Come, meet people. Eat something. He came. He ate. He listened. The conversation moved the way conversation always moves in a room full of people who share a secret they cannot name directly. In circles, around edges. Men spoke about Germany with a particular kind of longing, not for what Germany had become, but for what they believed it had once been. They spoke about Argentina's economy, about Pern's government, about friends of friends who had found work in Sao Paulo or in Chile. Names came up. Always carefully. Always with a slight adjustment in posture from whoever mentioned them. A small straightening, a brief pause before the name arrived. The operative catalogued everything. He would write it up later, in the apartment Mossad had rented for him in Palermo, in a notation system that used no real names and no direct references. A personal cipher he had developed over years, one that would read as nothing to anyone who found it. He was careful. He had been trained to be careful. What he had not been trained for was the man who sat down beside him after dinner. He was in his mid-60s, heavy-framed. He had been one of the men who shook hands at Mass the previous Sunday, the one who had held on a moment too long. He sat down now with 2 glasses of wine and set one in front of the operative without asking. He said, in German, "You are from Bavaria, then?" The operative said, "Southern Bavaria, yes, near the Austrian border." The man nodded slowly. He said his own family was from that region. He named a town. The operative knew the town. He said the right things about it, the landscape, the particular quality of the light in late summer. He had spent 3 weeks studying that region before he left Israel. The man listened. His expression did not change. Then he said, "It is strange. I know that area well. I have never heard of the seminary you mentioned." The operative did not reach for his wine. He did not shift in his seat. He said, with the mild patience of a man who had explained this before, "It is small. It was founded quite recently. Many people have not heard of it." The man looked at him. He said, Then he stood, picked up his glass, and moved to the other side of the room. That was all. A single syllable. One sound that could mean nothing or everything. The operative could not tell which. He stayed for another hour. He said his goodbyes with the warmth appropriate to the occasion. He thanked the hostess. He walked back to his apartment in the October evening air and sat at his table and did not write anything for a long time. The seminary cover had been constructed carefully. The institution it referenced was real, small, legitimate, obscure enough that most people would not know it well. The forged letters of introduction were clean. But the man at the dinner had said he knew that region, had been specific about it. had used the tone of someone who was not asking for information, but testing whether the information he already had matched what he was being told. If he knew someone who had actually studied at that seminary, if he made one inquiry, wrote one letter, asked one question through one of the channels available to men in that community, the thread would pull. The operative drafted his field report. He noted the exchange. He noted the man's physical description. He flagged the interaction as a potential cover compromise. Then he wrote 4 words that would circulate through the Buenos Aires support cell and reach Iser Harel within 24 hours. Recommend abort assessment immediately. Harel read the report in his hotel room. He read it twice. He did not recommend abort. What he sent back was precise. Continue, report daily. If direct contact from subject, use secondary cover and withdraw. Secondary cover meant a different explanation. A different story for why Father Stefan was in Buenos Aires. It had been prepared. It was available. It was also, as the operative well knew, significantly less convincing than the primary cover. A secondary cover is what you use when the primary is already compromised. Using it means admitting, to the people who pushed hard enough, that the first story was a lie. It buys time. It does not buy safety. The operative continued. In his 3rd week, he was offered something he had not expected. The regular priest at the small German language chapel in the San Fernando district was traveling for a family matter. The parish needed a visiting confessor for a Thursday morning. The parish priest in Palermo, who had taken a genuine liking to the young visiting brother, suggested Father Stefan. San Fernando was where Ricardo Clement lived. The operative accepted. He would tell himself, later, that he had not known the connection in that moment, that the assignment had appeared to him as coincidence, but he had studied the operational map carefully enough to know the district. He had known, when the name San Fernando was mentioned, exactly what it meant. He accepted anyway. He told himself it was intelligence discipline, that a good operative used what was offered. He sat in the confessional for 4 hours on a Thursday morning. He heard 12 confessions. He administered penance in the measured, unhurried voice he had practiced for months. He gave counsel to a young woman anxious about her marriage, to an old man troubled by something he would not name directly, to a teenage boy who had stolen something small and was more frightened than guilty. He did not hear from Ricardo Clement, but in the 3rd confession of the morning, an elderly woman mentioned a neighbor on Garibaldi Street. She did not mention him by name. She mentioned him by concern, the pastoral kind, the worry of a neighbor who had not seen a man at Mass in some months and feared for his spiritual state. She mentioned his wife. She mentioned his sons. She mentioned that the family had been in the neighborhood a long time. She mentioned the street. After the confessions, the operative spent an hour in the parish hall. He drank coffee with the deacon, a young Argentine of German descent named Rodrigo, attentive and warm, who knew every family in the area by name. The operative said, as if in passing, that he had heard a family on Garibaldi Street had recently lost a relative in Germany. He expressed hope that someone had reached out to offer pastoral support. Rodrigo did not know about any such bereavement. But he knew the street. He mentioned 3 families. He mentioned their histories, their children, their particular needs. He was generous with the information. He was a young man who cared about his community and believed he was talking to a priest who cared about the same things. The 3rd family he mentioned was Clement. The operative filed his intelligence that evening. Spiaharoni received the report. He drove to Garibaldi Street the following afternoon and positioned himself at a distance. At 6:43, a bus stopped at the corner. A man got off. Aharoni had read, in the weeks since his initial negative identification, partial transcripts of a set of interviews that had reached Israeli intelligence, sessions recorded in Buenos Aires by a Dutch SS man named Willem Sassen, in which Eichmann had spoken at length about the final solution in the tone of a man reviewing his greatest professional achievement. Reading those transcripts had changed something in Aharoni's understanding. He had been looking, the first time, for a broken man, a fugitive. Someone diminished by 15 years of hiding. What the assassin transcripts described was a man who believed he had won, who had survived when others had been caught, who lived among people who knew who he was and celebrated it. That was not a man who would look hunted. That was a man who had learned to perform smallness as a choice, not out of fear, but out of discipline. The same logistical discipline that had made the trains run. Aharoni watched Ricardo Clement walk from the bus stop toward Garibaldi Street. He opened the folder on the seat beside him. He looked at the photograph Clammer had provided. 2 men at a construction site, one of them unmistakably older than the other images in the file, unmistakably alive. He looked up. He wrote a different entry this time. But here's what the operational record shows, and this is the detail that changes the shape of the entire operation. Rodrigo, the young deacon in San Fernando, had not mentioned the Clement family simply because a priest had asked about a grieving neighbor. When Rodrigo was interviewed years later, not by intelligence services, but by a journalist researching the Eichmann capture, he said something that had never appeared in any official account. He said he had already been thinking about the Clement family before Father Stefan arrived. He said there were men in that community who became careful when Clement's name came up. Who changed the subject? Who reacted with a particular quality of stillness that Rodrigo, who had grown up in Argentina and understood what kinds of men had arrived from Europe in the early 1950s, recognized as protective. He said he had noticed Father Stefan's interest in that street, and he said it had not surprised him. The deception had worked. But it had not worked the way Mossad believed it had. Father Stefan had not tricked a trusting deacon into revealing a hidden address. He had walked into a community where someone was already watching, already suspicious, and had confirmed, for that person, that the suspicion was worth holding. Rodrigo had not been deceived. He had been found. And now the operative was still in Buenos Aires, still attending masses, still drinking coffee in parish halls, and somewhere in that neighborhood a young deacon who was not fooled was deciding what to do with what he knew. The capture was not supposed to happen on May 11th. It was supposed to happen 4 days earlier. The team had been in position since the first week of May. Rafi Eichmann had walked every approach route to the bus stop on Garibaldi Street until he could do it without thinking. The cars had been rotated through different registration plates. The villa on the outskirts of the city had been prepared, an alarm system installed, a room fitted out, a female operative maintaining the appearance of a normal household, cooking meals, speaking to delivery men, hanging laundry in the yard with the unhurried rhythm of someone with nothing to hide. Everything was ready. On the evening of May 7th, the team took their positions. Eichmann did not come home on the regular bus. He did not come home at all that evening. The team held position for 2 hours past his normal arrival window. Eichmann made the call at 9:45. They withdrew to the villa. The cars were dispersed to separate locations. Nobody slept well. The next morning, Eichmann requested a surveillance check on the Mercedes-Benz factory. The report came back within hours. Clement had not reported for his shift that day either. This was the moment the operation nearly ended. There were 2 explanations. The first was innocent: illness, a family matter, an unscheduled day off. The second was the explanation nobody wanted to say directly, but which sat in the room anyway. Eichmann had run. If he had run, everything was already over. A man who had successfully disappeared once, with the resources of a sympathetic network behind him, could disappear again. Argentina was large. The rat line had other exits. He had a 15-year head start on knowing how to vanish. Harel convened the team. The abort discussion lasted 40 minutes. Peter Malkin argued against withdrawal. His reasoning was not sentimental, or if it was, he did not present it that way. He said that a man who had lived on Garibaldi Street for 8 years, who had a wife and sons settled in that neighborhood, who worked a factory job with a regular schedule, did not run on the basis of abstract suspicion. He ran when something specific frightened him. And nothing specific had happened. Eichmann was less certain. He said that men like Eichmann did not survive 15 years by waiting for something specific. They ran on instinct, on pattern recognition, on the small accumulation of things that felt slightly wrong. He did not say what those things might be. He did not need to. Father Stefan had been in San Fernando. He had asked questions. He had sat in a confessional 2 kilometers from Garibaldi Street and used the confidence of a dying woman's neighbor to extract an address. These were not the actions of someone invisible. The deacon had noticed. The man at the birthday dinner had noticed. These were facts the operative had reported and Harel had accepted as manageable. But manageable was not the same as contained. Harel made the call. Hold for 72 hours. If Clement did not reassess, on the evening of May 9th, Ricardo Clement got off the bus at the usual corner. He was carrying nothing. No flowers, no market bag, no newspaper. He walked toward Garibaldi Street with the same controlled, deliberate pace as always. He did not look at the cars parked along the road. He turned at the usual point. He went inside. One of the surveillance team filed the observation within 20 minutes. Aidan read it and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he was not frightened. He was sick. This was the incorrect assumption, and everyone accepted it because it was the assumption they needed. What the surveillance had actually shown was a man walking home with nothing in his hands on an evening when he would normally have stopped at the market. A man who did not look at the cars parked along his street, which could mean he was unaware of them, or could mean he had already looked and was now being careful not to look again. Nobody raised this. The relief in the room after 2 days of near abort was too strong. The pattern had resumed. The operation was back on schedule. May 11th was confirmed as the date. The team took their positions in the late afternoon. 2 cars were positioned within range of the bus stop. A third was staged further back as a secondary intercept if the first approach failed. Eitan was in the lead vehicle. Malkin was the physical anchor, the one who would make first contact. The bus arrived at 6:40. A man got off. He was wearing a coat that Clement did not usually wear at this time of year. It was heavier than the evening required. He had the collar turned up slightly. Malkin looked at Eitan. Eitan looked at the figure walking away from the bus stop. The coat was wrong. The collar was wrong. For approximately 90 seconds, the time it took the man to walk from the stop toward the corner of Garibaldi Street, the team sat with the possibility that this was not Clement. That Clement had sent someone else first to walk the route, to see what was waiting. This was not a paranoid thought. It was the kind of thing a man with Eichmann's operational background would do. He had been trained to think in terms of pattern disruption. He knew that predictable behavior was vulnerability. Malkin said, "It's him." He said it before the figure had turned enough for a clear look. He said it on the basis of the walk, something in the particular economy of the movement, the way the weight distributed through the stride. Aidan did not confirm. He did not object. The car moved. One of the team had been positioned near the bus stop, leaning against the car with the posture of a man with a mechanical problem. As Clement approached, the operative turned and said the only Spanish phrase the team had collectively agreed on. "Un momentito, señor." Clement stopped. He looked at the man by the car. He looked at the road ahead. In that fraction of a second, something moved across his face, not panic, not recognition, but a kind of settling. The expression of a man who has spent 15 years knowing that a moment like this was possible, and has decided, somewhere in the intervening years, how he will meet it. He said, "Yes?" Malkin came from the other side. The physical capture took 11 seconds. Clement was taken to the ground, then into the rear of the vehicle, a blanket pulled over him before the car had fully stopped moving. The engine had not been turned off. The entire sequence had been rehearsed until it required no communication. The car moved through the Buenos Aires evening traffic at a pace that did not attract attention. In the back seat, under the blanket, the man who called himself Ricardo Clement did not struggle, did not make a sound. Eitan reached back and ran his hand along the man's left arm. finding the place where the file said Adolf Eichmann carried a scar from a cycling accident in 1932. He found it. He said nothing. 3 blocks from the villa, the car stopped at a traffic light. A police vehicle pulled up alongside them. The officer in the passenger seat looked at the car. He looked at the driver. He looked at the car for long enough that the driver had to make a conscious decision not to look back, to maintain the particular quality of stillness that reads as boredom rather than fear. The light changed. The police vehicle moved on. At the villa, the team brought him inside and sat him in the prepared room. The doctor checked him. Blood pressure, pulse, physical condition. He was unharmed. He was calm. Aharoni began the first interrogation. He asked the man his name. The man said, Ricardo Clement. Aharoni said nothing. He waited. The silence in that room lasted longer than it should have. Long enough that it had its own quality, not the silence of a man deciding whether to lie, but the silence of a man deciding whether the lie was still worth the effort. Then the man gave 2 numbers. SS membership, 45,326. Nazi Party membership, 889,895. He recited them the way a man recites something he has known so long it has stopped meaning anything. The way you recite your own address, or your date of birth. Without emphasis. Without visible emotion. He did not say his name. He did not need to. In the kitchen of the villa, the female operative was making dinner. The smell of food moved through the house. Outside, the Buenos Aires evening was completely ordinary. Traffic, voices, the distant sound of a radio. The man who had organized the murder of 6 million people sat in a room and waited to see what came next. And somewhere across the city, in a parish hall in San Fernando, a young deacon named Rodrigo was thinking about a German priest who had left rather suddenly, and about a family on Garibaldi Street whose husband had not been seen in several days. The announcement did not come from the team on the ground. It came from David Ben-Gurion, standing before the Israeli Mossad on May 23, 1960, 12 days after the capture. He said, Adolf Eichmann is in Israeli custody. The chamber went silent. Then it did not. The Argentine government learned about it the same way the rest of the world did, from a radio broadcast. They had not been consulted. They had not been warned. A sovereign state had been entered without permission, a resident removed without extradition, and the operation had been conducted by agents traveling on forged documents while posing as tourists, businessmen, and at least one member of the clergy. Buenos Aires filed a formal protest at the United Nations within 48 hours. The diplomatic crisis that followed was not a minor inconvenience. Argentina had been the destination of choice for the Nazi rat line precisely because its government had, for years, offered something close to a guarantee of non-interference. That guarantee had just been broken in the most public way possible. Argentine officials who had known who was living in their country, and there were several, now had to manage the exposure of that knowledge without appearing to have protected him. The response was anger, performed anger in some cases, genuine anger in others. El Al was barred from Argentine airspace. The airline would not fly to Buenos Aires again for 57 years. Israel acknowledged the operation. It did not apologize for it. The UN Security Council passed a resolution declaring the action a violation of Argentine sovereignty and requesting appropriate reparation. Israel expressed regret for the breach of sovereignty, while making clear that no reparation involving Eichmann himself was under consideration. The legal argument was straightforward. No existing extradition framework would have produced Eichmann. Argentina had refused every prior request involving Nazi war criminals. The West German intelligence service had known Eichmann's location since 1958 and had done nothing. The CIA had known and had done nothing. The mechanisms that existed for bringing men like Eichmann to account had already demonstrated, repeatedly, that they would not be used. Israel had acted outside those mechanisms, it said so plainly. The diplomatic wound healed slowly and incompletely. It left something behind, a precedent, a template, a demonstration that Israel would reach into foreign countries and remove people it considered war criminals, regardless of what the host government preferred. This was understood by every intelligence service that studied the operation. It was understood by every government that harbored anyone Israel might one day want. It was not entirely a deterrent. But it was not nothing. The trial that followed was its own kind of operation. It opened in Jerusalem on April 11, 1961. It lasted 57 days. It was televised in 37 countries. 112 witnesses testified. The prosecution had made a deliberate choice. This trial would not be conducted as an exercise in legal efficiency. It would be conducted as a historical record. Survivors would speak. In their own words, at whatever length they needed, about what had happened to them and to the people they had known. This was not universally accepted as the right approach. Legal scholars argued that the trial's purpose should be narrow, to establish guilt for specific charges, not to construct a national memory. Hannah Arendt, covering the proceedings for The New Yorker, argued that the prosecution's framing distorted both the law and the history, turning a criminal trial into a political theater. Her observations about the defendant himself proved more durable than her criticism of the proceedings. Eichmann sat behind bulletproof glass and took notes in a yellow legal pad. He answered questions in the measured, bureaucratic German of a man describing administrative decisions. He did not deny his role. He argued, consistently, that he had operated within a system, that he had followed orders, that the moral weight of what the system produced did not rest with the individuals who maintained its machinery. This was the same argument he had rehearsed in the Sasson interviews in Buenos Aires. The same argument he had been refining, in private, for 15 years in Argentina while his neighbors thought he was a factory worker. The argument did not succeed. In December 1961, he was found guilty on all 15 counts. He was sentenced to death. He was hanged on June 1, 1962 in the early hours of the morning and cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean beyond Israeli territorial waters. He was the only person the State of Israel has ever executed. Father Stephan was debriefed within a week of the extraction. The debrief lasted 3 days. He had maintained his cover without a confirmed breach. He had provided the intelligence that broke the surveillance deadlock on Garibaldi Street. By every operational metric that Mossad applied to field performance, the mission had succeeded. The report noted, in a section that remained classified for decades, that the operative had flagged at least 3 moments of potential cover compromise: the man at the birthday dinner, the deacon in San Fernando, the early withdrawal that could not be explained cleanly through his official cover story. The report assessed each flag as having been managed adequately. Adequately was the word used. He never worked undercover again. This is recorded as an operational decision, not a disciplinary one. Deep cover operations extract something that does not always show immediately. The operative had spent 7 weeks inside a community that would have killed him if it had known what he was. He had heard confessions he had no right to hear. He had accepted the trust of a young deacon and spent it as an intelligence resource. He had worn a collar that granted him access to the private grief of people who believed they were speaking to God's representative. None of those people ever learned what they had actually opened their doors to. The deacon named Rodrigo was interviewed years later by a journalist. He said he had thought about Father Stephan occasionally over the years. He said he had eventually understood, in broad terms, what must have happened. He said he did not feel deceived in the way he might have expected to feel deceived. He said he came to find someone who needed to be found. Whether he believed this completely is not something the record can establish. It is what he said. What the record does establish is that the method worked because of something the church had built over decades: the moral infrastructure of the confessional, the trusted anonymity of the priest in a community, the assumption that a man in a cassock was not a threat. That infrastructure had been used by Bishop Hudal to move killers out of Europe. It was used by Mossad to locate one of them. The cloth did not change. The use of it did. That inversion, the same cover, run in opposite directions across the same decade, is not unique to this case. It belongs to a longer doctrine, one built across dozens of operations in which identity itself becomes the primary weapon. The cases that established that doctrine, the ones that shaped how deep legend operations are constructed and when they are considered worth the cost, are not in any public record. Some of them are in the ebook we put together, linked in the description below. It covers the operational history of identity-based intelligence work, the legends, the long covers, the moments when the method succeeded, and the moments when it consumed the person using it. The link is in the description. If there is a question this operation leaves unresolved, it is not whether the deception was justified. It is whether the deception was ever finished. The man at the birthday dinner asked one question, and then moved across the room and never asked another. The deacon watched Father Stefan leave and drew his own conclusions. The threads were not cut. They were abandoned in place, still live, in a city where men who knew how to pull on threads had been living quietly for 15 years. The operation ended when the plane landed. The deception did not. Tell us in the comments which part of this operation you think carried the highest risk, the cover itself, or the moment it almost wasn't needed.